revealing any truths to say the world is moving in a fascist direction today when we least thought that's where we were going to go. That's back. And the question is, what are we all supposed to do? And what $6 Billion Man does, I hope, is show the young people who gathered together around Julian Assange when he himself was a young person, who went up against systems of power and abuse that they found unsurvivable. The fact that Americans don't have health care, to the fact that we're an empire that overthrows democracies. I felt like I'm throwing these arrows at that system to poke holes in it so that the public can see the bleeding and use that information and prepare themselves for a real fight for democracy.
So there's a central story where we get to see it from so many different viewpoints.
Yeah.
And all these people have ownership of this story. And I wonder where that comes from for you, because it's, in a weird way, it's like people at a campfire telling a story about the fire from a different point of view.
Or a group of young people, not so different from you and me. And instead of just accepting the crimes of the powerful against all of us, they went up against them. Don't we love that when we read about it in literature or movies? So if we love it there, what's wrong with us that we look for DiCaprio instead?
I couldn't be happier than to be sitting here with my old friend, Eugene Jarecki. And this film could almost be called Why We Fight, because it's a reminder of why we fight, isn't it?
Yeah. Why we fight as people against systems of power, why we fight as a society in the sense of why war is so much the dominant component in our grammar as a nation, America that is. But of course, as America goes, so goes the world, because I think it was Lance Armstrong who once said he was asking about doping. And he basically said, well, the margins between myself and the other cyclists are so tiny that if one of us dopes, they're going to win every race. So you all have to dope. And I think when America dopes, meaning when it relies on the addictive nature of violence as a mode of conflict resolution, then everybody's going to do that. And you see the Chinese muscling up and building their navy up. You see other countries, India and Pakistan flexing their muscle, Russia flexing its muscle, North Korea at the lead of the list. And I think America needs to look at herself, why we do this, why we made the law of the jungle the ruling law of our time, rather than whatever democracy was supposed to produce as a mode of understanding.
I couldn't help but watching it. We should say it's about Julian Assange, but the information that WikiLeaks were exposing reminded me of all the information that's been exposed in the Nixon administration about our dealings in South America.
Right.
And I'm certainly hearing the president of Ecuador say, oh my God, of course, there's a tradition of pushing up against North American intervention.
Yeah.
Because our history of doing that there.
Yeah, I mean, the movie is very much, it's called The $6 Billion Man. Julian Assange's name is not in the title for a reason. It's in the subtitle so that people have a sense of his role in it. But the truth is, it's about why the U.S. government was willing to pay $6 billion to destroy any person. What was that person doing that made them want to destroy him, bury him, and his team of young radical rebels who were going up against effectively the Death Star? You know, America, I heard George Lucas recently talk about Star Wars this way, and I hadn't known that he thought about it this way, but I got a holiday in my heart when I heard him, because he said, Star Wars is nothing less than the old story of young rebels up against an empire.
No, you know, in the first Star Wars film, which is now the fourth Star Wars film.
Yeah,
but the very, very end of it, it's basically a restaging of Triumph of the Will. You know, those columns of soldiers are moving around just like something out of Reframing. Yes, yeah. I mean, it's there to sort of remind us that, you know, the pulse is fascism. And
I admire that Lucas has let the public know in some recent interviews that he sees it as nothing other than a parable about capitalism, American power, American empire. And fascism. And look where we're headed now. Everybody, we're not revealing any truths to say the world is moving in a fascist direction today when we least thought that's where we were going to go. That's back. And the question is, what are we all supposed to do? And what $6 Billion Man does, I hope, is show the young people who gathered together around Julian Assange when he himself was a young person, who went up against systems of power and abuse that they found unsurvivable, and that they were systems of abuse that are counter to democracy.
It's funny, God, always so much to talk about with you. But first of all your work, and I told you I reread the book to get ready for this. your book, which is wonderful.
And I told you you're the 13th person who's read my book.
Stop it. Anyway, but your pieces are always about the way information is disseminated. They're always about that. What is it about you that drives you to that, the way information gets out?
I'm the child of a Holocaust refugee on the one side, and I'm a child of, my mother's family came from Russia where they were persecuted by the Tsars. And as a young Jewish American moving into the world and feeling that I was a person of some privilege and that I was able to talk about things that were otherwise not being talked about, I grew up at a time where truth itself became the plaything of the powerful. And behind that is not funny. When truth is the plaything of the powerful, the poor will pay. Everyday people will pay. And as a person who had the privilege and the right to communicate these things, to me, not to do so would be death itself. What was the point of my life if I don't speak for the voiceless? Because I'm not voiceless. There's that beautiful quote from Eugene Debs where he said, while there is a underclass, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. I'm not free if the world is living in a concentration camp of deceit, which is what we live in. And so if I have some access to information, I have some privilege as a pudgy white guy, I have some privilege as an American who still lives in the, I sort of, up until now, I've been riding, I realized this recently when Trump came to power, I realized that my whole career prior to that was, I've got a bow and arrow and I'm firing it at the central crimes of the American state, from Vietnam to Iraq to the fact that Americans don't have health care, to the fact that we're an empire that overthrows democracies. I felt like I'm throwing these arrows at that system to poke holes in it so that the public can see the bleeding and use that information and prepare themselves for a real fight for democracy. But I only realized recently I was riding on a boat called the USS Constitution. There was a constitution that protected my ability to do that. Now, the scariest situation of all exists, which is that people who do want to speak the truth now face absolute peril to life and limb, as Julian Assange did, as Chelsea Manning did, as Edward Snowden, who now cannot even live in his home country.
But by the way, both those people are in the movie.
Yes.
You got both of that.
They're in the movie as a tribute to the struggle that they have also contributed so life and limb to, because those are the heroes of our time. It goes back to that Star Wars. In Star Wars, in the Hunger Games, and all the literature we love about rebels going up against those in power. And even the mythologies we tell about the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto rising up against their Nazi perpetrators, or Black South Africa rising up against the Afrikaner class and undoing that. We love those things in America. We love those things when they're not about us, and we love those things when they're not real. We love the rebels going up against the dark side, but when you then have a real case of it, Julian Assange and this young band of rebels going up against the darkest of the darkest part of the dark side in the American story, all of a sudden we're happy to believe crazy propaganda about them, perfectly choreographed by the powerful to distract us.
But the other side too is this thing that's always been a part of America that's gotten bigger now, which is to say the idea of basically the theory that somebody's controlling something and they're keeping something from. So it's easier to ascribe that to people being crackpots or egomaniacs,
right,
rather than dealing with the facts at hand. When you talk about this band of young people, as you remind us, the original WikiLeaks consortium consisted of Der Spiegel and The Guardian,
the New York Times.
And the New York Times.
Yeah.
I mean, major news gathering organizations were a part of that. And it's something that we tend to forget because it's so easy to stigmatize it.
The news organizations that worked with WikiLeaks once upon a time have gone through an interesting coming of age. When it first went down and they learned what WikiLeaks had in its possession, thanks to the courage of Chelsea Manning, a young U.S. Army private who had found all this incredibly dark stuff inside the annals of the U.S. government and had taken the risk of life and limb to share it with WikiLeaks so that it could come out. When WikiLeaks did that at that time, news organizations saw red meat. They were like, oh my God, this could be the biggest story ever. We want it on our front page. We will plug our nose because we don't really like him. We'll work with Julian Assange. He seems like a snob. He seems like
He seems like a snob?
He's a bit snobby. He's got a certain arrogance. It might just be also the way he looks like. Who knows what he's really like. But they said, we want in.
Sure.
But then when things got, and they felt very courageous, and I'm sure they told their spouse when they got home, honey, I'm really doing journalism, blah, blah. Cut to when shit hit the fan, they ran for the hills and they abandoned WikiLeaks and they left WikiLeaks very alone, holding the bag anti-government. This many years later, the New York Times, the Spiegel, and all the other media partners that once worked with Julian Assange, when they saw that Julian Assange, a publisher, was going to go to jail in America for potentially 175 years for publishing the truth about war crimes, they wrote to the U.S. government and said, he is a publisher. This would be an attack on journalism itself. So they all come around now, maybe a little too late, but a little too late is still something. And it's a good direction.
It's interesting, again, because there's so much connective tissue in your work. I mean, just watching stuff to get ready for this. Not only is all not only are all your films about politics, about information being disseminated, but even your Elvis film is about information and the way stories are being told and how those stories change from one person to another. Right. And that fascinates me too about your work, because in watching the Elvis film again, and not me, Elvis, the other one.
Yeah.
But watching that film again, just think,
the other one.
Yes. The people look.
The brother of another mother.
Many generations ago, yes.
Yeah.
But also the way people sort of make a story their own. And that's something that's really specific to you, that it's run through your work, that there's a central story, but we get to see it from so many different viewpoints.
Yeah.
And all these people have ownership of this story. And I wonder where that comes from for you, because it's, in a weird way, it's like people at a campfire telling a story about the fire from a different point of view.
I believe in the collective growth of humanity. And I think that Margaret Mead has that beautiful quote where she said, never doubt that a small group of people properly organized can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I fear the way we put individuals on pedestals. Sometimes I even fear it in my own thinking. Why did I make a movie about Elvis? Why did I make a movie about Reagan? Why did Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican president, figure so centrally into why we fight? Why did I make a movie about Henry Kissinger? Why these big white men? Why am I so fascinated by these people? And the truth is, I think I'm guilty of the same cult of personality that we are all guilty of thinking history is made or broken by individuals, when the truth is somebody like a Donald Trump may be a broken individual himself, for whom we should all have enormous, frankly, compassion, because this is overtly a warped person. But he also couldn't be possible without the Times having so lost their religion. It's like an abused person who has an abusive spouse, and for years and years and years they're abused by their spouse, and at one point they conclude, whoever walks through that door, the next minute I'm going to go with them because I'm so beaten and hurt and weary. And then in walks a charlatan. This happens every day with abused people. That's America. America went with an abusive new person simply because they had so lost their religion on the ways they've been abused before. And I think that's where this is crucially understandable. We must understand that we are collectively engaged in a kind of crazy hero-villain circus that we get into, which is really not where the world is shaped. It's shaped by the fact that America disappointed the American people for decades until they were willing to go with this crazy direction that we are now in. And we will only unmake that if we stop thinking it's about them and recognize in the most cliched way that it's about ourselves.
But you're saying something I think that your films are all about, which is this idea of American exceptionalism, that there is one individual who's worthy of our attention. And that's specifically and particularly and peculiarly an American kind of mythology.
It is, yeah.
And I think that so much of what you've done is about that hunger for somebody who basically converts himself into a myth. I mean, I think it happened sort of inadvertently with Elvis, but these other people you've done, the Reagan doc and certainly his Kissinger, were supervising their own conversion into myths. And it's kind of, Assange is saying, there is this ascension to myth, but even though he's a publisher and ostensibly somebody who could tell his own narrative, it's taken away from him, but he still turned into this exceptional person. I think there's a kind of American mythology that you always want to poke holes in, or at least make us ask questions about. When you say, why these big white men? Because so often they're treated as binary figures, and they are not.
Mm-hmm. I think in the history of civilization, the American chapter, and it doesn't seem like we're in the American chapter anymore, but the American chapter, when it happened, was a chapter in which previously kings and queens and dukes and lords had kept everyday people down under their thumb. The individual was suppressed in his rights, in her rights, in the capacity of people to express themselves. The good news is the French Revolution, the American Revolution, these were moments where the individual was allowed to rise up. Great, so far so good. Enter capitalism. What capitalism did was it then armed those people to have a now larger than life impact. There should not be an Elon Musk in a world where he has accrued the amount of money he has and everyday people are starving all over the
That
world.
weighs on mythology too, because you look in the abstract at what that company was. I know people at Ford are going, why is it that we produce more cars? We have a bigger effect on the actual economy than he does.
Right.
But this company's value is so high, again, because it goes back to that mythology.
The overinflation of the individual. And we live in that, and we aren't yet savvy about the way we're being fooled, and in fact, the way we are fooling ourselves. I mean, the truth is, we can have this conversation, but if Leonardo DiCaprio walked by right now, we'd all go, where? Right? And it's like real substance.
So you just hurt my feelings by saying people look at me. And secondly, I think what's most important is I think people want that. I mean, I think we're at a point where we're savvier than we ever were.
Yes.
About the machinations and manipulation, but I think there's this appetite for that. And so often in your work, you're asking that question, why is there this appetite for a single story to be told about somebody? And that's really the heart of this film, isn't it?
It's probably why there was religion. I think in a very confusing universe, people grabbed on to all the faiths that we see, our efforts to make sense of a very frightening, disorderly universe that we don't totally understand. And so we cling to simplifying narratives. And so a complex narrative is WikiLeaks is revealing truths about the country that was supposed to be the best country of all because it was a new stage in the evolution toward democracy. But what if there are really unsavory, dark chapters in that? And we're going to have to explore those and falling asleep. It's not a headline. Another headline is DiCaprio's out on the street, or guilty, Julian Assange accused of, or Daniel Ellsberg is a kook, wears a tinfoil hat. All these we quickly label whoever, Obama wasn't he's born in Kenya, all these things. They are quicker to digest, and those in power are clever if they want to distract us with this theater of well-choreographed propaganda. And an hour later, we're still talking about that, and 1 million Iraqis have died, and we haven't even mentioned it. We haven't mentioned it, you and I. Even in this conversation, which is no harm about us, but it's the nature of the beast that it's all up here to keep us from going down here. But we won't survive if we don't go down here. We will just do this until the Titanic sinks and we keep rearranging those deck chairs. We've got to get to the underlevels of why this thing is happening the way it's happening, which I do think I agree with you. We're getting closer to. People are savvier, particularly Gen Z people. They see a lot that I didn't see growing up. I took a lot of it at face value, and I believed the American story and American graffiti and Casey at the Bat and all that bullshit. And now I'd be far more reluctant to accept a narrative at face value.
I think that there is that, but I also think that even in these stories you tell, I mean, at some point, the protagonist, the central figure, if you will, goes from being considered a hero to a villain to a hero to I mean, the films, I mean, it's remarkable, and I hadn't thought about that until I saw this, that you're trying to show this complication that exists, that we're all trying to digest this complication, even though it's just constantly being condensed and boiled down to something simplified.
Yeah.
I use simple, but simplified.
Yeah.
But that war between, well, are you this or you that?
Right.
You're still making stories, or you making us ask questions about this campfire mythology that we're being fed.
In an age of universal deceit, this is a George Orwell quote, telling the truth itself is a revolutionary act. And when I confront propaganda as deep and far-reaching as that which the U.S. government has disseminated against Julian Assange, there is a need to counter propaganda with the opposite. But an exaggeration, an excess, a false accusation against somebody like Julian Assange, do you meet it with equally strong, sort of Michael Moore tone, where Michael Moore says, I'm going to out-strident you, I'm going to out-entertain you, Fox, I'm going to be even cooler than you are, but I'm going to be equally extreme in my phrasings. I'm going to make George Bush look like a complete buffoon to a caricaturish level, blah, blah. Or is the better part of valor to come at deceit with truth, with the gray? They're coming with a black and white. I can either go white to their black, black to their white, but then we're in this like endless cycle of extremes versus extremes when we all know life isn't like that. Most things are on a bell curve. They're all kind of very few angels, very few devils. Most of us are in the middle. So I try to come with the gray as much as I can, because Julian Assange may not be your favorite person. You may find certain ways he talks or does or thinks or whatever else not exactly to your liking. But would you have gone up against the most powerful nation in history to share with the public things that you thought they needed to know? That takes great courage. That has to also be recognized. And the group of people around him are a group of young people, not so different from you and me. And instead of just accepting the crimes of the powerful against all of us, they went up against them. Don't we love that when we read about it in literature, movies? So if we love it there, what's wrong with us that we look for DiCaprio instead? I keep saying poor DiCaprio, he's a great person actually, but he's the standard for look how much he just happened to be a great person and does good things and gives himself to causes and stuff like that. And he's got the dad bod, which makes people like me feel better. So it's like, it just means that we get ourselves down those roads when we know better. This is like, do you go to therapy or not? Or do you tell yourself a bunch of bullshit? Right? It took me a long time in my life to come to terms with my own need to therapize myself. And if I need to, a country needs to, all people need to, or you're not really in the game. Then you're just popcorn eating while life goes by, and then you die one day and they say some nice things.
Well, I guess now we know your next film is going to be on Leo DiCaprio.
Yes.
But that aside too, I mean, there's a constancy in this film of making us look at things. Like I was telling you before you sat down here that one of the times I was in London, I made a point of going to the block where the Ecuadorian embassy is. And I saw, this is an apartment building.
Right. You were expecting grand, yeah.
It'd be something like, with all the embassies in D.C.
Yeah.
These big buildings that are impermeable. You could have just driven a car right into there and got it if you wanted to. And it made me think, actually, it sent a chill through me seeing the building because I thought, well, it's completely vulnerable. And what we learned, and this thing that this is one of the things I didn't know in seeing the doc, is that the company that the Ecuadorian government hired in all good faith to do security was owned by a confidant of Donald Trump.
Yeah, in the end, that embassy was robbed from the inside because the security company that was hired by Ecuador ended up being run out of a Las Vegas casino by the operatives of the late Sheldon Adelson, who owned the Venetian Casino in Las Vegas. And it turns out, you wouldn't believe it, that Julian Assange was spied on inside an embassy by an operation run out of Las Vegas. And when Trump came to power, that operation moved to Washington, to the CIA itself. And so Julian Assange could never have had a trial in America of any merit because that trial, he had no attorney-client privilege. They'd been listening to all of his lawyer meetings for the entire time he was in supposed political asylum, violating every right, every tradition of how political asylum is supposed to protect someone. And that's just the smallest part of what the U.S. paid $6 billion for.
I'm talking grand things. I want to talk about the filmmaking in it, because one of the things I love in the movie is that the opening credit sequence is scored, but if you don't own me,
yeah,
which is a reminder that also, and the montage too, is that Assange was also a part of pop culture.
Yeah,
which I thought was a really important thing to do, just not make it up here to remind us that he was a part of this swirl.
Right.
And that's where the mythology comes in. And I thought it's a really brilliant thing to do with it, to just do it in this sort of intertextual way.
Yeah, I remember one of our producers, a story producer on the film, Noel. He came in one day. He said he'd cut a new splash for the film, and I have a team of really smart people, and I get to take credit for their work ultimately. So yes, I don't know how I thought of that. Brilliant, yes. But no, that was somebody came in and cut most of that montage by themselves, and I just thought it was so powerful. He and the young editor Simon cut that thing together, and I was just blown away by it.
But it must have been a great fix to say, they basically boiled down some of the ideas of the film and what the film is seeking to do into that montage. It's really great.
I'm glad you think so. I'll tell him.
Yeah. Tell him to Leo.
And I'll tell him I took credit for it.
Tell him that Leo said.
Leo said. Leo was really into that part. Didn't like the rest.
But it's a reminder too, again, pop culture, that his life was so impactful in so many ways outside of politics or mainstream news. To see that, be reminded that one of his closest friends was Pamela Anderson.
Yeah. And Pamela's contributions to the public's understanding of Julian Assange. If you watch Pamela Anderson, just go on YouTube and look at her appearances, for example, on The View, where she comes out there. She's like a kung fu fighter for Julian because she met him, got to understand what made him tick inside the embassy, and it was her conclusion that she was dealing with a seminally heroic person who had gone up against the America that somebody like Pamela knows the dark side of America too. If you look at the cannibalism that was conducted against her by the American people and by the American media system, she identifies with a victim a victim in a cage.
Somebody whose story has been oversimplified and turned into this one thing and said you're this and nothing else but this. If anybody's going to have empathy for that, it's going to be her.
And look at the renaissance she's having. That they call it a Panaissance.
It's great. But
everyone should be so proud for Pamela Anderson and what she's achieved.
But it's the other funny thing, too, about this that, because I think it actually contradicts the Fitzgerald line that there are no second acts in American life. There's nothing but seconds.
I don't know where that exactly. Right.
And a
correction.
I think he saw the clock ticking, running down on him.
Yeah.
But I feel like at some point, and I wanted to ask if you thought this might happen, that there might be a shift for him because all these people get second chances at being regarded in the public sphere.
I think the truth now is that I expected to have to go on the road about this film and constantly defend Julian Assange. But the truth is, what are we defending him from? The supposed rape accusation in Sweden, which now turns out to have been quite a shady operation of non-due process in Sweden, was ultimately not a case in Sweden. It was an inquiry, and it was formally dropped. So he doesn't face that anymore. He has been exonerated in his U.S. government case.
But going after that rape case, well, you mentioned, because I was telling people I was going to watch, and they go,
it's the first thing they raised.
It's the first thing I said, but even before I saw the film, remember, he was never charged.
Right. They don't know that. Most people think Julian Assange was charged with rape in Sweden. No, and I'm not here to debate what happened between consenting individuals. There are two women involved in this case who have the right to their lived experience. Sure. I'm not getting into that. I'm not going to start to imagine what goes on behind closed doors of consenting adults. What I am there to say is, did I see state malpractice against due process in the conduct of Sweden? Yes. Do we see that Sweden's at minimum weapons relationship with America is an enormous one? Yes. Is there a lot said to us by people in Sweden about the shady terrain that represents? Yes. So let's say that out of fairness to all involved, the case in Sweden was formally dropped. That's no longer facing him. The U.S. case, he was exonerated. The U.S. government dropped 17 of the 18 counts they had against him, and the only one he pled guilty to is journalism, which is now, in the eyes of the U.S. government, a crime. We are living at a time where America, founded on the idea of a free press, is now so desperate to cling to its hold on power and so desperate to keep the public from knowing what's going on in this world that we desperately need to know what's going on, that they are criminalizing journalism itself. Right now, they're criminalizing dissent in America. That's what this war on the university is about. That's what this war on students who want to think different. You have students on campuses echoing what the UN has said. There is a genocide happening in the world. The UN has called it a genocide. When students speak for the UN, it is criminalized as dissent in America. People are deported over it. People are incarcerated over it. And people are trying to scare them into silence. So those three things, we automatically see what Julian Assange faced he's been exonerated from. What are the other big ones? People say, oh, he helped Donald Trump get elected because he leaked information on what the Hillary campaign was doing to Bernie. Well, don't we want to know in America what our campaigns are doing to block the rights of voters in America who might have wanted a Bernie Sanders? Might we ask, would we be living in the same America right now if Bernie had been elected and not Donald Trump? So isn't that newsworthy? Well, the New York Times thinks so. The New York Times said publicly that what WikiLeaks did in the 2016 election was newsworthy, and they would have done it themselves. And yet we live in a world where somehow it's perceived, because propaganda is effective, that what WikiLeaks did in 2016 is some kind of information crime. No, it's information, and that's been made a crime. And do we want that?
It's funny because, not to go back to DiCaprio again, but what's even happened in organizations like the Times or the Guardian is that there's been a shift in those places to covering entertainment and treating that, or pop culture, and treating it as if it deserves the same kind of spotlight,
right,
as does this story, which 50 years ago, the time of Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, and when the Times and the Post were fighting to cover Nixon and what was going on there, this story would have been, if the world still existed in that way, this story would have been in the front of it would have remained on the front pages of the newspaper.
Yeah.
But as newspapers gradually enacted their own diminution of their stature by covering more pop culture, I think that sort of changed their focus.
I think we start to understand what the Romans meant by bread and games.
Yes.
We always think of those things and we say them humorously, and then we suddenly wake up one day and we're living in that.
Yeah.
Right? Gladiatorial stuff. What are we seeing now? I guess I heard that the Trump administration wants people to be competing with each other so that they get a legal status in America. He wants to have a Hunger Games of people to get their status, right? That's what the country that once opened its arms to the poor and the huddled masses is now doing, is making gladiator sport out of qualifying. That is harrowing, should be of concern of the deepest, most emergency, DEFCON level to every American, whether you're a naturalized American or not. And instead, we got Britain Games. We have the news media feeding us that which stimulates our addictions, our addiction to Leo, our addiction to carbs, our addiction to porn, our addiction to all that stuff, the pornography of modern life, all of the stuff that's cheapest and dirtiest that we all are drawn to like some kind of dumb animal. They feed that instead of appealing to the deeper part of ourselves that builds community, that cares about each other. And you see that more and more. So the media is off doing its thing. The public is really growing in another way, as you pointed out earlier, that's deep and interesting and beautiful. More and more community activity, more and more intentional community building, all of that. And yet over here are short-term profit seekers in the business of basically selling addiction, of peddling addictive material of one kind or another to distract us from that community work. They're trying to draw us away from what we know is best for us. So we ought not be drawn away.
I guess as you're saying this, I'm thinking about that, especially in watching the Reagan film, about how quaint that kind of Republican presidency seems now. And moderate. Yeah. And the same thing with Kissinger. Oh my God, you look back on those days where at least Nixon had a sense of shame.
I know. But let's give credit where it's due. At their time, they were as violative of standards and norms of morality and decency relative to their time as these guys are to the much debased standards we're in now.
Sure.
But they contributed to the debasement of those standards. So George Bush should not tell me how much he doesn't like Donald Trump, because he got us here. Henry Kissinger should not marvel. I know he's gone, but before he died, he started marveling at the excesses of today that he produced. He put us on that slippery slope. But these are, again, let's get away from individuals. Kissinger was a reflection of the willingness of American power to stop at nothing at that time. Donald Trump isn't a reflection of the willingness of American power to stop at nothing in his time.
To that point, and it's actually a question I was going to ask, so I'm glad you led me there. Each of these films has been about these individuals as mirrors to where we are. And I wonder if that was kind of an idea that you had with each of these films, because certainly the theme links them all thematically. I mean, Elvis or Reagan or Kissinger or Assange, they are mirrors that we can hold up to ourselves to regard where we are at that moment.
If the public relates to these films, it probably means they relate to me and my team, who are stumbling through a wilderness of ideas. We are not in charge of some very clear storytelling plan. I would be bullshitting you if I acted like I know what I'm doing when I start. All I do is I smell fire and I go looking in the brush.
But there are thematic links in these pieces.
There are, because to a guy with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I've got certain conditioning that comes out of the Holocaust, that comes out of previous episodes in history of man's inhumanity to man. So I'm loaded for bear. So when I smell that fire in the woods, I'm going to find my way there. And of course, I bring a certain moral architecture, and I hire people who have a range of views. They don't all think the same, but they have a similar dedication to getting it right. If I take a position, even in defense of our subject, that's excessive, half my team will position themselves as enemies of Julian Assange. So they will play the other half. And it's not insincere role play. They're not sure what they think. And I'm not that sure what I think. And if I were sure, I think the films would be boring and non-explorational. And the reason they are explorations is that they are explorations. And you can feel it. You can feel that I didn't totally. There's one moment in the Elvis film where a guy in the film was fixing Elvis's Rolls Royce, and he can see that I bought this car to go across the country for a film, and it's a bit of a crazy reach. He says to me, what are you doing with this film? And I said, what do you think I'm doing? He goes, I don't know what you're doing with this film. Some metaphor about America and Elvis. And then he kind of summarized the film better than I could. But the truth was, he got me on a road trip where I was finding my way to some reflection of at least the pursuit of truth. That's what I model. I model the pursuit of truth. And if I enter it with a plan, let's say a script or something like that, I think I'm just making an elaborate pamphlet of what I thought when I started. And I don't think there's vitality in that.
But I think the one thing I always get from your work, written or cinematic, is the pleasure you get in the work. I mean, there's a real enthusiasm about doing it. And I think that's, even when people feel like they're passionate about something, your passion is about the pursuit as much as it is and the filmmaking as it is the subject. And,
Yes.
and there's this kind of glow that comes from I've mentioned this to you before, each film is that much more confident than the film that came before. And to cram as much self as you, because there are so many ideas in this that you're blinking when the film is over. And this is really startling for me to see, to look at the differences between the Kissinger film and this. It's just like, wow, there's so many firecrackers going off in it.
That's been a democratization of my process that came with time, and it came as I believe the world is becoming, at the popular level, more democratic. We can see that systems of power are becoming less democratic, but gains in our understanding of gender and race and community and dynamics, the fact that we know what things like gaslighting mean and stuff like that, means old modes of patriarchal argumentation, particularly of auteur filmmaking argumentation, where it was like my way or the highway, I know what this is about. Basically, I make a film about Henry Kissinger. Gibney and I made that film. And the truth is, we're not that different from Kissinger when we make that film. We are autocratic people running shops that are very driven by our ideas, hell or high water. As time has borne on, and I have a lot of scars just from life, you learn to trust others and you learn to integrate the views of a consortium, and then that consortium is a small reflection of the larger society. And I believe as long as you can keep it all in order, which is my task, as long as you can keep it all in order, you're bringing far more to the table than one little brain can come up with. Now I'm a filter for the thoughts of a collective, and now I'm a model of that Margaret Mead collective that I idealize. Then a small group of people is trying to change the world in a properly organized way, and indeed that's the only thing that ever has. I have tried over time to let go of power and let myself become more a leader among equals in a team of people. And so it's not some kind of faux modesty that I keep crediting my team. I am my team. My team is fundamental. So I could get choked up, and my team is fundamental to what's in that film. There's people who in my team can see their fingerprints on every frame of that thing. And all they see is that I didn't throw them under the bus or forget what they said or whatever.
Well, clearly we could do this all day since we have nothing to talk about, but I'm so glad you came by. So good to see you.
Thank you. Great.